Let's start with a big question. What if silence isn't empty? We're often taught that if someone can't speak, they can't think. But what if that's one of the biggest misunderstandings we've ever had? Today, we're diving into a really fascinating theory that flips our entire understanding of communication on its head.
Our source material really just nails the whole problem with this one quote. It's a powerful warning. Just because a door is locked, it doesn't mean the room behind it is empty. This whole idea reframes silence. It's not a lack of thought. It's just a barrier, a lock that maybe we haven't found the right key for yet.
And that leads us to the core question for today's explainer. What if our scientific methods, our tests for understanding these minds, are just fundamentally flawed? What if, in our search for proof of a mind, we've been looking in completely the wrong place?
To really get this, we've got to go back a bit. The source describes the history here as creating what it calls an iron cage, a prison built not with steel bars but with low expectations and a really basic misunderstanding of the human mind.
So to explain this big mistake, the source brings up a concept from yogic philosophy, the Annamaya kosha. Now, that sounds complicated, but it just means the physical body, this outer shell. The argument is that early science focused only on this layer. They saw the uncontrolled movements, the inability to speak, and they made this gigantic leap of logic, assuming the mind inside must be just as broken.
And this right here, this was the flawed assumption that everything was built on. The logic was brutally simple. No words from the mouth means no thoughts in the mind, period. And according to our source, this single, devastating idea is what trapped countless brilliant minds in that iron cage of silence.
But a cage like that can't hold forever. And this next part of the story is all about the turning point, the moment when cracks started to show, and we got a glimpse of the incredible, active mind that had been hidden away all along.
And then the proof just started pouring in. You had individuals who started communicating by painstakingly tracing letters on a board. And they weren't just asking for things. They were writing poetry, asking these deep philosophical questions. Even more amazing, eye-tracking tech showed them looking at the right letter on a keyboard long before their uncooperative hand could ever get there. The evidence was all pointing to one unmistakable conclusion. A fully active mind was in there. The body was the prison, not the mind itself.
But of course, a breakthrough this big doesn't come without a fight. This new evidence kicked off a fierce debate. And the conflict was all about these controversial new methods that claimed they could build a kind of invisible bridge to these silent minds.
So this is where something called facilitated communication, or FC, comes into the picture. The whole idea was pretty simple, really. A facilitator would provide some light physical support, maybe a hand on an arm or a shoulder, and this would somehow help the person bypass their motor control problems and type out their thoughts. I mean, it was a totally revolutionary claim.
But the scientific community was not buying it. Not at all. When they put it to the test, the gold standard, a double-blind study, it failed. Again and again. See, if the facilitator didn't know the answer to a question shown only to the individual, the correct answer was never typed. The conclusion seemed inescapable. The messages were coming from the facilitator's unconscious movements, not the non-speaking person. For mainstream science, that was it. Case closed.
But hold on, this is where our source just flips the whole table over. It argues that the failure isn't in the communication, it's in the test itself. The claim is that the experiment's design was actually built to fail because it totally misunderstands what's really going on.
And this leads us to a completely different way of looking at this whole thing. The source proposes this wild, alternative theory. A theory not about one mind trying to speak, but about two minds working together in a way we don't really understand.
Okay, so let's break this down, because it's a fascinating idea. The theory suggests the non-speaker is in a deep, intuitive theta brainwave state. Think of it like a mind just buzzing with raw ideas, pure creativity, but with no way to organize it. The source even calls it a psychic capacitor. Now, the facilitator is in a calm, focused alpha state. They act like an energetic anchor, providing the stability and the coherence needed for those raw ideas to be channeled into a physical action, like typing. So in this model, it's not one person typing. It's two minds creating a shared field that makes it all possible.
And there's a name for this, pranic interdependence. Pranic has to do with life force energy, and interdependence means they rely on each other. The best analogy is two jazz musicians improvising. They have to be in sync, right? They're feeding off each other's energy, listening and responding to create something new. The theory argues that a double-blind test, by separating them and cutting off that shared awareness, is like putting those two musicians in soundproof rooms and then being surprised when the music stops.
So, if you look at it from this perspective, the failed tests don't prove the non-speaker's mind is empty. Not at all. They just prove that the communication needs two attuned people. The scientific test is designed to prove independence, but in doing so, it destroys the very symbiotic connection that might be making the whole thing work in the first place. It breaks the thing it's trying to measure.
Okay, I know this is all pretty abstract and out there. So to try and make it a bit more concrete, the source proposes a thought experiment. It's called the Dragon Trial, and it's designed to test for this invisible connection.
So here's how it would work. You have an anchor, a trusted person, who secretly writes down some specific, complex fact. Then, the receiver sits across from them in a quiet, meditative state. The anchor then silently thinks of a question related to that fact, and the receiver just jots down the very first thought or image that pops into their head. And here's the key. You're not looking for a perfect word-for-word answer. You're looking for what the source calls energetic overlap, a shared theme, a similar feeling, a key word, as possible evidence that these two minds are, in fact, sharing some kind of informational field.
And that's really where we land. With this huge fundamental conflict, you have the scientific consensus on one side, which is based on the idea that a mind has to be totally isolated and independent to be proven real. And then you have this wild alternative theory suggesting that maybe, just maybe, some forms of communication aren't a solo act at all, but a deep, symbiotic dance. It really forces us to ask ourselves, is communication always a performance by one person, or can it sometimes be a connection between two?